My husband and his mother created a secret prenup that leaves me with nothing. I found out on the day of signing. My name is Clara Scott, and I want to set down in words the entire story of how my husband and his mother conspired to draft a secret prenuptial agreement that would strip me of all my rights and leave me completely unprotected. I was born in a small city in the American Midwest. My parents were Margaret and Roger, a devoted couple with modest means and big hearts. Margaret was a teacher who specialized in early childhood education. Roger was a carpenter who spent his days building cabinets and tables for local clients. We were not wealthy, but I never lacked for anything important. My mother taught me how to read when I was 3, and my father taught me how to measure and cut wood so I could help him make little boxes and birdhouses. From an early age, I learned that trust, kindness, and honest effort could get you far in life. I saw in my parents a union built on mutual respect, neither overshadowing the other. When I was around 6, I recall my mother telling me that a good marriage was like 2 hands working together, each respecting the other's strength. I carried that lesson with me as I grew up. I attended a public elementary school, forging a few close friendships. My best friend was Lisa, a gentle soul who loved drawing. We spent countless afternoons lying on the living room carpet coloring pictures while my mother brought us apple slices as snacks. When I was 10, my father passed away suddenly from a heart attack. The grief nearly shattered my mother, but she fought on, taking extra shifts, doing her best to keep life stable for me. I mention this because from that moment onward, I saw how fragile life could be, and how easily everything can change. My mother told me she would always do her best to protect me, but that I also needed to be strong enough to stand on my own feet if life threw curveballs. After my father's death, I started helping my mother with chores. We had some financial struggles, but eventually my mother got a small life insurance payout that helped keep us afloat. She never remarried, devoting herself to raising me. I grew up with the notion that love meant commitment, that families helped each other, that open communication was key. High school was a blur of studying and working part-time at a local cafe to help my mother with bills. I was academically strong, so I got a scholarship to a local college. I majored in communications and took extra classes in psychology, fascinated by how people relate to each other. My mother remained my anchor, encouraging me to pursue my ambitions. She told me that a healthy relationship or marriage was built on honesty and shared respect. I took that to heart. I was in my junior year of college when I met Grant. He was a friend of a friend, and we dated for almost a year, but it ended quietly with no drama, just a realization that we were on different life paths. I mention him only to explain that I did not have a wide array of boyfriends. I was more cautious, taking my time to trust someone. Then, after college graduation, I started working in a local nonprofit, enjoying the sense of doing good for my community. My mother was proud of me. I found a small apartment not far from her house. We remained close, meeting every Sunday for brunch. I was content with my modest but purposeful life. When I was 26, I met Andrew Marshall at a fundraiser event my nonprofit hosted. He was tall, soft-spoken but confident, and introduced himself as one of the major donors. He was a bit older than me, around 30, with carefully styled dark hair and a watch that hinted at a comfortable lifestyle. He told me he had a background in finance and real estate. We struck up a conversation about the nonprofit's cause, and he seemed genuinely interested. I was charmed that someone with wealth would take the time to talk to me so kindly. He asked if we could continue our talk over coffee sometime, and I said yes, nervous but excited at the attention. Our first coffee date was at a little cafe near downtown. He was gracious, telling me how he admired my passion for charity work. I found him endearing and well-mannered. Over the next few months, we began seeing each other more regularly. He would often pick me up in his sleek car, take me to nice restaurants. I felt a bit out of my depth with the fancy spots, but he never made me feel inferior. Instead, he always insisted that I looked beautiful, that I was wise beyond my years, that I should get used to the finer things because I deserved them. I felt flattered, and a part of me was attracted to that sense of security he emanated, the sense that maybe I'd never have to worry about money again if we stayed together. My mother was happy I was dating someone stable, though she always reminded me that a person's heart matters more than his wallet. I told her Andrew's heart seemed good. Andrew introduced me to his mother, Harriet, about 6 months into our relationship. Harriet was somewhat aloof at first meeting. She had neatly styled gray hair, wore elegant clothes that I recognized as designer brands, and greeted me with politeness but not warmth. We sat for dinner at her large home in a gated community, and though Harriet asked me questions about my life, I sensed a mild disapproval in her tone. She was not rude, just reserved, as though she was sizing me up. I recall her praising Andrew's success repeatedly, highlighting how he took after her side of the family with an eye for business. Then she turned to me, telling me she hoped I'd be able to keep up with his ambitions. I smiled and said I'd do my best. She gave me a tight-lipped nod. Andrew didn't notice any tension, or if he did, he brushed it aside. I reminded myself that meeting a prospective mother-in-law can be nerve-wracking. Harriet had lost her husband years ago, so it was just Andrew and Harriet in that big house. They had a close bond. I tried to remain optimistic. Time passed, and Andrew and I fell deeper in love. He told me frequently that I'd changed his life, that I'd brought a warmth and sincerity he rarely found in the circles he moved in. He started talking about the future, about marriage, about wanting to start a family with me. Harriet never quite warmed up to me, but she was polite, occasionally inviting me to events at their country club, or to gatherings with relatives. I often felt out of place among those older, affluent acquaintances, but Andrew was always there to reassure me that I belonged. Harriet would nod and say that I'd eventually find my footing if I was serious about being part of their family. Another subtle jab, but I shrugged it off. After all, Andrew was the one I was with, not Harriet. If I had known how enmeshed they were financially and emotionally, perhaps I would have been more wary. Then, about 1.5 years into our relationship, Andrew proposed. It was a quiet proposal at a lakeside picnic, just the two of us. He knelt on a small pier, produced a ring with a modest diamond, modest by Harriet's standards anyway, and asked if I'd make him the happiest man on earth. My heart soared. I said yes, tears in my eyes, and we hugged under the open sky. It was a beautiful, genuine moment. I truly believed I had found a partner who respected me and wanted to build a life with me. We announced our engagement, and Harriet immediately insisted on throwing a large engagement party at her home. I was uneasy but tried to go with the flow. She invited many people from her social circle, turning it into a grand event with catering and live music, overshadowing the simpler celebration I might have chosen. Still, I told myself that Harriet was just proud of her son. She gave a toast praising Andrew's achievements and saying she welcomed me, though she slipped in lines about how I would be wise to keep his best interests at heart, especially regarding business decisions. I felt a sting but tried to remain gracious. Andrew seemed oblivious to these undertones, or if he noticed, he told me Harriet was just being protective. Soon, the wedding planning began. Harriet offered to pay for a significant portion of it, stating that she wanted the best for Andrew. I had some savings, and my mother offered to contribute what she could, but Harriet waved that off, telling me she would handle the big expenses. She said it was tradition in their family that the groom's side pays for the wedding. My mother politely asked if that was truly necessary, since she wanted to chip in for her only daughter's wedding. Harriet insisted no, that it was already arranged. Andrew told me to just let Harriet do her thing, since it made her happy. As the months of planning progressed, Harriet took the lead on many decisions. She booked a grand ballroom at a high-end hotel, far more lavish than anything I'd envisioned. She had Andrew sign contracts with expensive vendors, all while praising the benefit of an unforgettable wedding. Some small details that I wanted, such as simpler flower arrangements or a shorter guest list, were brushed aside. Harriet always said we have many family friends who must be invited, or that certain styles were not suitable for a wedding of the Marshall family. Andrew told me not to stress, that once the wedding day arrived, I'd be grateful for Harriet's generosity. But a seed of unease grew in me. Harriet kept telling me how the Marshalls had a reputation to uphold, that we must not cut corners. She also made pointed remarks about how I'd be stepping into a legacy, not just marrying Andrew. One night, after a particularly exhausting day of wedding errands, Andrew and I collapsed on his sofa. I asked him if we could scale back the reception, maybe remove a few of the more extravagant elements. He looked conflicted, then said that it was basically out of his control because Harriet was handling the finances. He added gently that if we wanted that money, we had to let her plan it her way. I fell silent, disappointment coiling in my chest. He noticed but said nothing, just held me. If only I had recognized that as a sign of deeper issues to come. Then, about a month before the wedding, Harriet first mentioned the possibility of a prenuptial agreement in passing, at a family dinner. She acted like it was the most natural idea in the world, saying that as the Marshalls had built a considerable estate, it was only prudent to have a contract clarifying property rights. My mother, who was present, looked uneasy but said nothing. I glanced at Andrew, expecting him to wave Harriet off. Instead, he just nodded slowly, explaining that many families with assets do this to avoid future legal battles. I felt a pang of betrayal because earlier in our engagement I'd asked Andrew if he planned on a prenup, and he said no, that he saw no need. He had told me he trusted me completely, but in front of Harriet he was singing another tune. Harriet insisted it was standard practice, purely a formality, and it should not concern me if my intentions were honest. I recall feeling my cheeks burn but forced a smile. I said if it was a standard we could talk about it, but I'd want my own legal representation to review it. Harriet smiled that perfect, cold smile, telling me that was wise. After that evening, Andrew tried to reassure me that Harriet was just being protective, that the final contract would be fair. He said we had time to go over it with a lawyer. I told him I'd never sign something that left me destitute or had bizarre clauses. He promised me it wouldn't be like that I'd be safe. He even said I'd be an equal partner. I exhaled in relief, choosing to trust him. The wedding day was creeping closer, and we were busy with final details. The prenuptial talk receded from my everyday thoughts. 1 week before the wedding, Harriet told me that her lawyer had prepared a draft and we should finalize it soon. She asked me to come to a lunch meeting, but I was swamped with work. She said no problem, they'd make an appointment at a law office for a day or two before the wedding, so I could sign the official documents. I found that last-minute scheduling suspicious, but Harriet and Andrew insisted it was normal, that everything was almost done, I just needed to show up. My mother, upon hearing this, told me to be careful, but I told her I was sure Andrew wouldn't sign off on anything that harmed me. How naive I was. We arrived at the final day before the wedding. The plan was for me to meet Andrew and Harriet at the office of Connor and Associates, sign the final wedding license and presumably the prenuptial contract, after I'd had a quick chance to see it. Harriet said I'd have time to read it, and we could tweak small details if needed. I was anxious but decided to trust Andrew. I was already exhausted from dealing with last-minute changes to the reception. My mother told me good luck and begged me to text her if something felt off. I left with a sense of foreboding but tried to brush it aside. We were so close to the wedding day. The next day, I'd be walking down the aisle in a dress Harriet had chosen for me, but I told myself I'd be focusing on Andrew, not Harriet, for that walk. We loved each other, right? We would unite in marriage as equals, or so I had repeated like a mantra. At the law office, Harriet was already seated with a stack of papers. Andrew was next to her, looking a bit tense. A stern man in a crisp suit introduced himself as Mr. Connor, Harriet's family attorney. Another associate lawyer hovered behind him. We settled into a large conference table, water glasses in front of us. The city skyline glimmered outside the floor-to-ceiling windows. Harriet gave me a polite smile, then motioned for Mr. Connor to begin. I noticed she was impeccably dressed, a sign of her readiness for a formal, possibly confrontational affair. Andrew avoided my gaze. Mr. Connor slid a folder toward me, explaining that this was the final prenuptial agreement. He said I'd have a moment to review, though we were short on time, as Harriet had a rehearsal dinner to attend soon. My heart rate spiked. Why so rushed? Harriet said calmly that we all had a busy schedule, so let's be efficient. She told me not to worry. It was straightforward. Andrew nodded, a tight expression on his face. My stomach churned. I opened the folder, bracing for legal language. The first few pages recapped basic disclaimers. Then, on page 3, I encountered the real substance. Harriet and Andrew had included a host of clauses stating that all premarital property from the Marshall side remained solely Harriet's or Andrew's, not subject to any community property rules. Fine, that was typical. But as I read further, I noticed lines about any new property acquired after marriage being categorized as separate property if the purchase was derived from the Marshall family funds. Another line disclaiming any spousal support if we divorced, no matter the circumstances. Another line disclaiming any interest I might have in Andrew's business expansions, even if I contributed my time or resources. My eyes darted from line to line, a pit forming in my stomach. This was unbelievably one-sided, giving me zero claim in a divorce or even a separation. I looked up at Andrew, speechless. Harriet said gently, "Are you okay, dear?" It's quite standard for families with substantial assets. She had that condescending note in her voice, as if I was naive for being alarmed. I almost couldn't speak from the shock. Then I kept reading, turned a page, and saw the final straw. A clause about children, specifying that custody would default to Andrew in the event of separation, and that Harriet's input would weigh heavily in deciding the child's upbringing. My hands trembled. This was horrifying. They'd even predetermined child custody, as if I was an incubator who could be dismissed if things went sour. I felt tears prick my eyes. My voice came out shaking as I asked Andrew, "Did you know about these clauses?" He didn't meet my gaze, quietly saying that Harriet insisted we protect the family's interests. I realized then that he had not only known, but also had no problem with it. Harriet eyed me, telling me not to be emotional, that it was standard practice for wealthy families. She said if I truly loved Andrew and had no intention of leaving him, this was all moot. My chest felt tight. He mumbled that he had tried to fight for some modifications, but Harriet said it was final. I stared at him, tears welling. He shrugged apologetically, as if there was nothing he could do. Harriet then told me we had to sign if we wanted to keep tomorrow's wedding on track. The ultimatum was clear. No signature, no wedding. Anger and heartbreak warred inside me. Harriet and Andrew had orchestrated this behind my back, timing it so I'd see it only hours before the ceremony. They expected I'd be too invested, too embarrassed to walk away. But they'd made a grave mistake. They underestimated my self-respect. I was so stunned I didn't even raise my voice at first. I quietly closed the folder. Harriet said, "Are you ready to sign, dear?" with a saccharine smile. I looked up, meeting Andrew's eyes with tears trailing down my cheeks. I asked him plainly, "Are you truly doing this, forcing me to sign a contract that leaves me with nothing in a divorce, no claim to any property, not even guaranteed custody of our children?" He stammered something about best for everyone, about it being a pure formality. I felt a cold fury blossoming in my core. Harriet tried to intervene, calling me dear once more. I told her bluntly, "I'm not your dear. I'm no one's doormat. I will not sign this abomination." Andrew then said in a trembling voice that if I wouldn't sign, Harriet might withdraw all financial support for the wedding, and we'd have to call it off. Harriet nodded, looking at me expectantly, as if to say I'd never dare let that happen. My tears gave way to a surge of adrenaline. "Fine," I told them, "then there's no wedding." Harriet's eyes widened in genuine shock. Andrew panicked, telling me I couldn't be serious. I repeated that I'd rather stand up and walk away than sign away my entire future. Harriet tried to hush me, saying let's talk calmly. I stood abruptly, nearly knocking over my chair. "You want calm, Harriet? Then you should have calmly told me about this months ago instead of blindsiding me on my wedding eve." I grabbed my bag, ignoring the tears streaming down. Andrew jumped up, trying to stop me from leaving. Harriet hissed at him to let me go, probably hoping I'd cool off. But there was no cooling off. The illusion was shattered. I'd spent a year believing Andrew saw me as his partner. Yet apparently I was just an outsider they had to control. The heartbreak nearly choked me as I left that conference room, ignoring their calls for me to come back. The ring on my finger felt like a shackle. I wanted to rip it off, but I was too numb. My chest ached with a pain I had never known. The rest of that day was a blur of tears, phone calls, and heartbreak. I told my mother everything. She was furious, telling me I'd done right to refuse. My father, who had been so ready to walk me down the aisle, grew livid, promising me that we'd manage the fallout together. The wedding was the next morning, but now I discovered the relationship I'd built was a lie, or at least overshadowed by Harriet's controlling demands, which Andrew had caved to. I didn't sleep at all, just lay in bed hugging a pillow, tears on my cheeks. In the morning, I woke up with puffy eyes and a raw heart. The day that should have been my wedding day dawned bright, ironically cheerful. I told my parents I was calling off the wedding. My father went to the venue to speak with the staff and gather any family that might show up. He told me to rest, that he'd handle announcements. I said I'd go with him. I wanted to face this. We arrived at the chapel at the time the ceremony was scheduled. A small group of guests had already gathered. My father asked them to wait, that I had something to say. The rumor spread quickly that something was wrong. A hush fell. Harriet and Andrew arrived soon after, Harriet looking tense, Andrew looking devastated. Harriet told me in a low voice to keep quiet, not to cause a scene. She said I'd regret it if I humiliated them in front of everyone. I turned to my father, who gave me a nod of support. So I stepped forward, with tears in my eyes, and announced that I could not marry Andrew that day, because I'd discovered a prenuptial agreement that left me with no rights, and they'd hidden it from me until the last possible moment. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Harriet turned white with anger, while Andrew tried to calm me, saying we could fix it. I recounted some of the contract's terms, hearing the guests murmur. I told them I wouldn't sign away my future or my dignity, and thus the wedding was cancelled. People stood in stunned silence. Harriet was seething, but some of my friends came forward to hug me, telling me I'd done the right thing. Andrew tried to speak, but I refused to let him. I said my piece. My father guided me away, tears streaming freely now, sorrow for the wedding I'd lost, but also a fierce pride that I had not caved. Harriet called after me that I'd never be forgiven for this public humiliation. I walked away anyway, leaning on my father's steady arm, aware I'd unleashed a scandal in their upper-crust circle, but no longer caring. I was free. That day, instead of walking down the aisle in my white gown, I left the chapel with my ring in my pocket, single and battered but not broken. Andrew tried to contact me repeatedly. Harriet, seething, told everyone I'd tricked them or that I'd always been after money. However, I'd shown enough people a copy of the contract that no one believed her. The story spread. Andrew wrote me a tearful letter apologizing, swearing he never meant to push me away, that Harriet had insisted on the extreme terms, that he was forced to comply. But it was too late. He had betrayed my trust. I wrote him back, telling him I'd always loved the memory of who I thought he was, but I could not marry a man who let his mother treat me like a threat. I wished him well, but told him not to contact me further. Over time, I found a sense of peace. My mother and father were relieved I had not locked myself into a marriage overshadowed by Harriet's control. My heartbreak eventually healed, replaced by gratitude that I'd escaped. Harriet apparently retreated from social events for a while, avoiding the scandal. Andrew left town for a few months, presumably to avoid talk. I built a new life, bolder and more confident, reminding myself daily that no love is worth sacrificing your dignity or your legal protection. That is how I overcame the biggest betrayal of my life, discovering on the day of signing that I'd be left with nothing, and refusing to sign, refusing to marry under those conditions, saving myself from a future of subjugation, and ultimately standing up for who I am.